after a bunch of fiddle, ready to get started. So as I said, we want to start with some of the terms that don't get translated, and we'll start with the ones that Craig mentioned, the non-translated from Greek. He has noesis, pneuma, and pneumata, right? So this is the original Greek word is just the word for mind, but it's also the word for thought. So the noumenal realm is the realm of of pure thought. But what's really going on here is if you take like the English word thought, you can use the English word thought in the sense of the thing you're thinking about or in the act of thinking it. And what's really going on here is when he says nomata with an ATA at the end, he's talking about the item thought, right? So it's thought in the sense of the thing you're thinking about, the content of the thought. That's the pneumata. He's taking the substantive thing-like ending in Greek, and he's adding it to the end of the thought or mind-like prefix. So the thing thought is a pneumata. And in contrast to that, the noesis, the one that ends in SIS, is just the act of thinking it, the act of thought, right? The kind of intentional act that the consciousness performs when it's thinking about the pneumata. And then confusingly, after he's made that distinction, the pneuma with an MA, no TA at the end, no IS at the end, is his term for that full structure of thought, right? It's the act of the noesis act pointing at the pneumata thought. That together, if you use thought to mean that whole structure of the thinking act, intending or thinking about the thing thought, that's the pneuma without a pneumata, right? So pneumata is the thing you're thinking about, the noesis is the act of thinking it, and the pneuma is the complete thought that is that whole relation. So most people, even in Greek, these terms don't get used with that subtlety or distinction because people tend to conflate all those things. But because he's carefully distinguishing all of them, he distinguishes between the act of thinking, the thing you're thinking about, and the relation between the two of them together as like the whole thought. So in computer language terms, right, thoughts are pointers, and they've got a name of the pointer, which is like the noesis, the act. They've got the register in memory they're pointing at, which is the pneumata, right? And the whole thing together that's setting up the relation between them is the pneuma. Okay. The other one that people, what was the other one you were mentioning? Oh yeah, hylic, right? So the hylic, hyl is Greek for matter, especially in Aristotle. And first you have to understand that there's lots of places in here where you'll see the word matter, and it isn't always a translator for hyl, right? He's using hyl here, or hylic level, that is the translator, well, not even translator, Levinas, to refer to a particular piece of Husserlian matter. So matter to Husserl doesn't mean the physicist's matter. Matter means more like the subject matter. It means whatever the content is, because he's always talking about stuff inside consciousness, because he's a phenomenologist, or he's almost always talking about stuff inside consciousness. He means something like the subject matter. So a sensation has a matter, right? The matter of the sensation is, it's not even the thing that the sensation is about. It's like the actual conveyed textured grayness of the couch I'm looking at, right? The textured grayness content there is the matter of that sensation in his terms. It's something like the content or conveyed thing or payload of a sensation, so to speak, is what he means by the matter in that case. But thoughts at other levels will also have matters. It's not restricted only to sense, right? So form and matter is a distinction he'll use in the kind of semi-Aristotelian way about any of these kinds of levels of analysis. And in all those cases, the matter means more like the content, and the form means more like the, it can mean the act, it can mean the intention, it can mean any other inflection about it. But so matter is often used in that very loose sense. when he's talking about the Heil or the Hylitic level, he's using it in a more restricted sense than that. He does mean the sort of matter level, but the matter level not as exterior matter, but as something like the raw material of sensation in the stream of consciousness. Not even the stream of consciousness, even pre-conscious, right? Well, not quite pre-conscious. It's the impression stream, the before you have organized things into objects, pure stream of raw material for consciousness is what he means by the Hylic level. So this is what Hegelian would call, immediate experience, something like that. But it's the idea of the sense data not even organized yet, just as like a raw stream, right? So a raw temporal stream of impressions is a Hylic level, and then the idea is that that conscious thought organizes all of that stream, discovers patterns in it, constructs objects out of it, intends things or highlights things out of it, and so forth. So not everywhere where he's saying matter is he talking about that sort of raw data stream level of interior consciousness. Where he does say Heil or Hylitic level, he's definitely talking about only that, right? So it's like a raw material sensations level of experience. Okay, and all that gets put into shorthand by just using this Greek word for the. It's not even just that term gets used as for matter in Greek, it gets used for prime matter in Greek. It's like the most underlying level of matter is kind of the meaning of the Greek word. But here the quote matter is contents of consciousness, not like protons and anything like that, right? Okay, so that gave us some of the Greek ones that don't get translated. There's a bunch of, the other Greek one that doesn't get translated is epoche, which is the Greek for suspending judgment or withholding of assent, especially in skepticism. This is his term instead for the transcendental reduction as bracketing of any thesis about the transcendent sphere. So Jim wasn't here for this last time, but what we mean by imminent and transcended is something like transcendent is whenever the mind is trying to think about something outside the mind, and imminent is when the mind is trying to think about something it experiences inside the mind, so to speak. So my senses of my mood may be have as intentional objects events in the interior of my consciousness which are imminent, right? The Hylitic level as I experience it is imminent, right? The sofa over there is transcendent in the sense that it is outside of my consciousness. The thing that is transcending is consciousness. So what epoche means is in order to be able to see the phenomenological layer or level of experience, you deliberately suspend your judgment or bracket all of the theses you might have about transcendent facts, right? So it's as though you're watching yourself think about things, and you're watching yourself think about things as though all the things that you think are referring to transcendent objects and all the theories you have about how the transcendent world works and all the causal scientific theories you have that are more elaborate and based on things farther downstream, you put all those in brackets. You still notice how you think about them, but you're not doubting them. You're just not allowed to consider those as determining anything about the thought layer you're focused on. And this is just a way of isolating the immanent layer, basically. If you want to isolate the immanent layer in order to be able to see the phenomenological level of experience, that's the idea of the epoche. So people often compare it to the Cartesian doubt, but it's not quite the same thing, because it's not literally a doubt that the things you know about the external world are untrue, like it is in Descartes. But it is still what it shares with Descartes is this idea that you do something to your knowledge of the external world in order to investigate something else. In the case of Descartes, it's because he wants to reach a proposition which he considers more secure than his knowledge of the external world. In the case of Husserl, it's because he wants to isolate the imminent layer in order to view it without what he considers the distortions of naturalist theories, right? He doesn't want, when you're looking at how you think, to import some materialist psychological thesis about how it's happening, instead of just watching how you actually think. Craig, was there a question?
Yeah, so as I listen to the way this is being described, the sense that comes up to me is, how is this possible? Does it really happen? Or is he just making something up?
I think it definitely does happen. I mean, he goes through in detail in both logical investigations, but especially in the ideas, examples of the procedure, right? And it's done just by shifts of focus. He doesn't voluntary shifts of focus. He is definitely differentiating it from Cartesian doubt, because he's claiming that the thoughts that you're bracketing, or the aspects of your thought that you're bracketing, you're not actually doubting. You're not actually thinking there is no external world. You're not actually thinking, that sofa over there isn't an object with me in the room, right? You're just noticing that the evidence you have for that sofa being an exterior object in the room with you consists of some of the following things. It has a persistence through time in my experience of it in the phenomenal layer, right? So there's things you notice about the level of your consciousness if you shift attention to those things, which you can see are, if we put it this way, the bits of evidence or the trails of your intentional acts of attention that are involved in organizing that set of the input to my visual field into the sofa over there, right? Like the fact that it sits still when I walk around it, the fact that it has all kinds of invariants in my mere stream of experience. I know that it's not something just inside. When I do this, I can manipulate it in various ways. So there's all these things where you, by shifts of focus and attention and recognizing what's independent of what, as you do different both mental acts and physical acts, right? You can focus in on what your evidence is for these transcendent propositions rather than the content of those transcendent propositions. That's sort of how it works.
So basically, Levinas just presented it and didn't go into all the details that Husserl presents on.
Yes.
Going
Yes.
about it. That seems to help. Yeah.
Yeah. This is definitely a case where Levinas is only giving you the Cliff Notes version. He is definitely not taking you through how the epoche works.
Yeah. So the same sense of what I get the sense of is it's kind of a uniqueness that I've always felt that humans have, because I can work my head this way and I still see you. Do
Yes.
that with a pattern recognition camera in an AI
Yes.
application, and it's screwed.
That's right. So I mean, I'm changing the position of this thing. I mean, obviously, to be fair, the first time we've been able to do it with anything computer-like was when we had very sophisticated convolutional neural networks that have to find invariants of shifts of translation and so forth, right? But we do all of that effortlessly by the common intended object of the that we're taking through time in various sorts of variations, right? And what Husserl is trying to do is connect that to this sense of intentionality, in the sense of ascribing meaning to the terms laid down in a system, so to speak. What I want to mean by the sofa over there is this organized set of a bunch of things selected out of my stream of experience, right? And that's very much like the kinds of things that we now think of as constituted 20 layers deep in the CNN as some invariant that it wouldn't have even noticed in the first 10 layers or something like that. So he was, I think, way ahead of his time in recognizing those kinds of things. The place where he took this into the most detail was probably in his book on time consciousness, where he just notices the differences between the sense of the present, the sense of the recent past that's used to detect motion, the sense of memory, which is different from both, noticing that there are invariants in the direction of whatever counts as now, and also invariants in the direction of whatever counts as the object I'm experiencing as persisting through time, which I track through a succession of nows. And he makes the startling claim that subjective time is two-dimensional on the basis of this, not one. Where there's a one-dimensional searching thing of the present going forward, but the time invariance is being used in two different ways. It's being used to just notice the changing sense content at a particular point, so to speak, and also the a stability, a cross-time stability, right? He uses examples from music, especially a held note or a melody, right? We detect intentional objects which are extended in time, which are not focused only on the present, right? So recognizing that that is the same tone, right, is an example of this. And then melodies, even bigger example of this. A remembered melody where you can anticipate the next note, an even better example of this. All of these have to do with the fact that we are the intentional object of sense experience in those cases is not something which exists only at a blink in time. We're trying to detect a time extended object. So anyway, the focusing on those sorts of things, he picks out what sort of the evidence layer is as distinguished from the theses it leads us to about the truths about the transcendent objects. Great question, though. And to me, a big part of what makes Husserl like one of the most rigorous phenomenologists, one of the ones who's like methodologically impressive, is how he goes into detail on all these things, right? There's a lot of later phenomenologists who are more concerned with the conclusion they're driving for, and Husserl, in contrast, is taking the very small baby steps where he can be sure of his ground every time and laying all of it out. One of the results of that, though, is that he can be very long-winded, right, and sometimes hard to follow, right? It's like you needed 3 chapters to get me to this point. So that's one of the reasons people often try condensing him. Okay, I want to go through a bunch of these other untranslated terms. So probably the single biggest one in the second half of our reading today was the Sachverhalt. A Sachverhalt is a state of affairs or situation. Why does he care about a Sachverhalt? The basic reason is that he's trying to distinguish between the level of perception and like the level of thing about which there are propositional facts, right? So when a Wittgenstein wants to start off his book by saying, the world consists of facts. The facts are, each thing that is the case, and he's imagining that these things can correspond to propositions that have truth values of true or false. Husserl's throwing a flag on the play at the first step of that, right? Facts are complicated, constructed things that come later than the constituents of the world. Facts are states of affairs. So that my computer is sitting on this table is a state of affairs. It's something I can have a propositional truth about. My experience of the computer, right, is not yet a state of affairs, right? There's plenty of things in the level of perceptions which are not yet in the at the level of or in the form of, full predicated sentences making, abstract claims about logical truths or empirical truths, right? Things which are abstract propositions, and the truth of those abstract propositions is a question about the truths about states of affairs, about whole Sachverhalt. So he's distinguishing all that from perception. In perception, you do not yet have a proposition, right? It's not my perceiving the couch over there is not me ticking off a list of 40 propositional statements I could make about the couch over there and determining whether or not each one of them is true. It's quite the other way around. The only way I could do the second of those things, the only thing I could check them against is my perceptions of the couch, right? So the perception of the couch is first as a base layer, and the propositional truths I could, or claims I could make about it is a layer above that, a more abstract layer, a layer of selected out propositions about aspects of things, so to speak. The level of factual, propositional-like claims about some things are the state of affairs level of things, if I can put it that way. So states of affairs do consist of facts about which you can have propositional claims, but the world doesn't. The world has all kinds of stuff going on before we get to the level of a state of affairs. And then the same, the Sachverhalt, the Verhalt part is just an affair. So he also will have, Wertverhalt and Wunschverhalt, which is, a state of value or a state of desire, right? There are things other than states of fact here that have the same structure in the sense that they are where you get to the propositional level, if I can put it that way, the level at which you can have propositions about that aspect of things. But it's distinctly phenomenological and Husserlian that he denies that the fact level is the base level of the world. Okay, so that's the Sachverhalt, which Levinas is like, he thinks that's so important a term that he won't translate it.
Then right after that is Merkmal.
Sorry?
Which he also does. Right after that on page 82 is Merkmal, M-E-R-K-M-A-L.
Yes.
Properties.
Yes. Yeah, he could have translated that one, I think. we covered last time Erlebnis, which is usually just translated as experience, but it really means more like lived experience, because the Lieb in it is the word for life, right? So Erlebnis is lived experience. The characteristic Husserlian claim is all lived experiences are conscious, which some of the people would dispute, but lived experience, Erlebnis. Then you get Empfindung, which is a sensation in the sense of the subject matter of a particular sensation, and then that with Daten at the end is sense data. Auffassung is often the word which is often being translated here as intention, but it has the literal meaning of exception. It's just the notion of that our attention picks something out of a background flow or horizon, highlights it. The best translation of it that Levinas uses is apprehension, because it has that apprehend, that notion. Unfortunately, apprehension is only a good translation of it because it's just Latin for the same concept, right? But just Latin instead of German, but it's as complicated a word as the other one. We talked about Abschattung last time. That's aspects, shadows, or perspectives. It's the term for the single-sidedness of the perception of any extended thing. You get schlicht in a lot of places. That's just simple, easy, or direct. And then full for full, and erfüllt, which gets translated as realized, but more literally means fills in or fulfills. Bedeutung for meaning, and Vorstellen for presentation or representation. We'll definitely get to, but those are the ones which get least translated in Levinas, if I can put it that way. Were there other ones that gave anybody trouble about things which weren't translated? I think we lost Jim for a second.
I'm here. I just wanted to turn off the video because I'm still trying to get range. But I'm listening to all the terms, and I appreciate you guys.
Got it. Okay, so let's now talk about the intuition part, because this is one thing that Craig mentioned last time, that one of the problems is that he's clearly using intuition here in a way which is very different from the way someone like Jung would use it. And what's going on here, what does he mean by it, what's its sort of scope. And the place where there's sort of the biggest difference here is how they would both relate intuition to perception. Because the way Jung uses it, intuition is almost a polar opposite of perception, right? He thinks of the sense impressions, perception of exterior things as being, a relatively simple kind of thing that we can understand sort of scientifically, and almost mechanically in Jung, as opposed to intuition, which is something like things in Jung, things that that you don't have a rational or sense explanation for why you know them, something like that. And he can have his own whole theory about how those reflect sort of some subconscious thinking, which we're not fully conscious, but may also involve intuitive capacities that were useful, selected for, adaptive. There are all these kinds of theories of how it could come about that are floating around in Jung's version of what intuition is. But the thing he's trying to separate off is also defined by a kind of polar opposite of it's a felt true thing in the interior of consciousness that doesn't have obvious rational reasoning or sense data-based support, something like that. So in that sense, Jung is using it as a term which is meant to be distinct from sense impressions, almost entirely distinct from sense impressions. Joe?
Who came first in terms of publishing and using that term, Jung or Husserl?
Husserl is slightly before him. They're contemporaries. Their working periods definitely overlap. Things like logical investigations are earlier. Things like ideas is coming around at the same time that Jung is writing about these things. And their working careers definitely overlap in the aftermath of World War I down to interwar period. So and the way that Jung is using it is not too idiosyncratic. It definitely did have those meanings at the time. The way in which Husserl is using it, which we'll get to in just a second, is much more indebted to a scholarly tradition of what it means in like Kantian and neo-Kantian philosophy, more academic use of the term among philosophers, rather than a kind of popular use of the term by the man in the street, which is closer to sort of Jung's meaning for it. The inspired guess version of intuition is what Jung is aiming at, right? Where the person cannot explain why they got it right, but they got it right, right? And he can, give you all of his reasons why he thinks that people are good at that, right? But all of this is happening in part because Jung has these categories set out in a way trying to distinguish things from a single ideal type of a kind of rationalist, positivist, empiricist philosopher, right? That he imagines as always, relying on empirical facts, verifying things with logical chains of reasoning. All of these things are Jung's way of saying, not everyone is a Lockean British empiricist, 98% of their day, right? And he's trying to point out all the parts about human psychology that are bigger and more complicated than that. That's sort of what Jung is doing with the nature of these distinctions. Compared to all that, Husserl thinks that sense experience itself is way more complicated, has lots of things about it we need to understand. And here's the biggie. Husserl doesn't think that the British empiricists types and the positivist types understand how sense experience works nearly as well as they think they do, right? He thinks that sense experience is an important paradigm for understanding knowledge, but only if we pay attention to how it actually works. Okay, so in Husserl's using of the term intuition is bigger than sense experience, but it includes sense experience. Sense experience gives us the objects of sensual intuition the objects of sense. It's not even the sense data. The transcendent objects about which we get information in sense data, right? We have given to us in a kind of sensual intuition, right? So our correct intuitions about exterior objects that we can arrive at through sense and rational understanding of what sense data tells us, that is already intuition to Husserl, right? He is going to extend that to other things that we know intuitively with something like the same givenness or evidence that those truths of sense have for us. And he's going to claim that there is a similarity in manner of the other things that we know intuitively with the way that we know intuitively facts that are that we learn from sense experience, right? So intuition to Husserl is a term that covers a whole bunch of things that we feel internally that we know for certain, the things which seem self-evident to us, including lots of things for which that self-evidence is coming from our senses, right? It's more like a internal sense of self-evidence of something that he's getting at with intuition. But it's not just that internal sense. He thinks that internal sense is correct in those cases, right? The formulaic version of it is intentions aim at objects, intuitions reach them, right? So and when he says that, he is emphatically including our sensual intuitions about the sofa over there, right? The fact that my sensual intuitions about the sofa over there are correct is because my intuitions reach the actual object, and he's going to trace where that same kind of evidence, that same kinds of self-evidence, that same kind of sense of intuitively confirmed occurs for things other than perception in the sense experience sense, especially things we might call interior perception, if I can put it this way. That can include perceptions of your own acts, perceptions of mental acts. It can include perceptions of mathematical truths, perceptions of logical truths, right? Where the positivist thinks that it's obvious how logic or math works, Husserl is noticing that actually you have to pay very careful attention to how logic and math works and how you can know that something that follows logically or something which is the truth of mathematics, how exactly do you know that it's true? He thinks that you do know that it's true, but that it's intensely interesting how you manage to know that it is true in those cases. And he'll distinguish the logical, pardon me, the logical from the mathematical in that, in the sense that in the case of math, the matter of the thing you're thinking about is important, not just the form of the things you're thinking about, whereas logic is something like a purely formal level of where that evidence is possible. Okay, so compared to someone like Jung, the whole area of thought that Jung would regard as purely rational thought and purely perceptual thought is to Husserl vastly more complicated, and everything about it needs to be carefully analyzed and understood. And he thinks that if you do that, you will arrive at a notion of intuition of which perception is the paradigm example and a big proper subset of it, but nothing like all of it, right? So there are other areas of experience about which we have intuitive knowledge besides perception, but the kind of intuitive knowledge or sense of self-evidence that we get in perception is still for him a paradigm of what we mean by intuitive knowledge. All of this has to be sharply distinguished from the kind of skeptic who thinks that there's something doubtful about any empirical fact because it's empirical, and thinks that like only a truth of logic or math could be truly certain and all empirical truths are not because they depend upon some confidence in the apparatus or something like this. There's none of that in Husserl, right? The sense of evidence that you have in perceptual knowledge is to him a paradigm of what knowledge means to us. Okay, so intuition is not being sharply distinguished from perception. Perception is one of the types of intuition, one of the areas in which we have intuition, but intuition goes beyond and goes farther than that and includes lots of other things about which we have intuitive knowledge, in the sense of our thoughts successfully reaching the things we are intending to think about, and those things being simply present to us. Okay. So the real problem, area of problem that Husserl has trying to explain what intuitive knowledge is like, especially at these more abstract levels. What I mean by the abstract level, I mean the level of the state of affairs, the level of propositional truth, the level of logic, rather than perception, right? That, in a way, is a higher level to Husserl because he's starting from lived experience. So perception is pretty close to the surface of lived experience. When you're getting up to logical truths or mathematical truths, you're getting into things which are more and more abstract, in the sense of farther from the layer of the immediate stream of consciousness, right? And at that more abstract layer, the question is, what does intuitive presence of the objects themselves to us mean? You're going through a mathematical proof, right? You verify the steps and you convince yourself that it is evidently true. How did you do that? It wasn't by looking at a couch, right? So what is the nature of doing that? And the thing which has to be most clearly distinguished there between intuitive truth is another kind of what he calls just signifying truth. What does he mean by signifying truth? He means that all of these sort of abstract counters or terms can be used not for their actual or immediate meaning, but just as signs of something else. Okay. And he's trying to distinguish between the places where we have an intuitive knowledge from the places where we're doing, if I can put it this way, just signifying reasoning. What do we mean by this? Right. So in the case of intuitive knowledge, you can have the thing itself and you can verify it. In the case of signifying reason, you don't necessarily have it. The best examples of this are complicated math problems, if I can put it this way, where, okay, I tell you that I'm going to take 2 to the 2 to the 2 to the 2, or maybe 2 to the 2 to the 2 to the 2 to the 2, and I tell you that the resulting number in its decimal expansion, the second digit is 5 and the last digit is 6, right? I just told you something which you can verify is true, whether I gave you 4 of those or 5 of those, because whether the actual number, if you multiply it all out, is 256 or is 6,000, 65,536, in both cases, my later statement is true. But if you only verified those 2 things, you wouldn't have any intuitive knowledge of the fact. You could get the right answer. Yes, it is 5 for the second and 6 for the last digit of that thing's expansion. You could get that right answer whether you knew I said 4 of them or 5 of them or not, and whether you multiplied the thing out and verified it for yourself or not. You only have intuitive knowledge if you've done the actual operations in between. If you've seen for yourself, right? Okay, I do the entire calculation, I get the decimal number, I write out the decimal number, and I look that the one 2 to the left is 5 and the one all the way on the right is 6. Right? If I've done that, if I perform that operation, if I mentally have that picture in front, in the interior of my consciousness, I have an intuitive verification that this is the case. Right? I could get the right answer without doing that. I could get the right answer following only signifying intentions, but that wouldn't be intuitive knowledge of it. I wouldn't have intuitively verified it. Okay. So what's the point here? The point is he's trying to track when we're just effectively playing with syntactic counters and when we're tracking the full semantic meaning of every step of a piece of reasoning. If you've got sort of the full meaning all the way along, and that's how you're following it, and you have an internal picture of what's going on, and you verify the internal picture corresponds with what the syntactic reasoning says, then you have an intuitive knowledge of the thing. If, on the other hand, all you noticed is this chain of propositions seems to follow logical syntactical rules that were laid down to me, and you're verifying it the same way a machine might, right? But you don't see any of how one step follows from another or any of the rest of it. You're just being mechanical about it. You don't have any intuitive knowledge of it. Examples from, it might be hard for people who don't know the actual math involved, but examples from like analytic geometry or point set topology are the clearest way of seeing this. They're the kinds of things where if you actually have the image in your head of what the thing is talking about, you not only can verify that a proof is true or that something follows, you see it, right? Try to explain to someone how you know it. The answer is, I can see it, right? You can have a mental image of all the pieces of what is being talked about. There's a correspondence between a set of images you can have in your head and the set of chains of reasonings about the concepts under discussion that can put them one to one and onto, and with all their meanings preserved, and no hidden steps, right? That's intuitive knowledge of an abstract thing. If, on the other hand, all you have, go ahead. Yes, go ahead, Greg.
When another example, kind of as you went through the little math example, what came to me is we learned all these math tricks, like in grade school, junior high school, we learned all these math tricks. And then junior year of college, I took number theory.
Yep.
And now I learned what the foundation of all those tricks was.
Yes. Before you were just applying them mechanically, but you had no idea why they worked. Yes.
Yeah, but then you take number theory and suddenly the key unlocks the whole thing as to why those things work.
Yes.
And how they work. And,
yes.
And so that's
I'll give you another.
Is kind of the example.
Yeah, exactly. Another perfect example is you memorize 40 different sets of trigonometric identities, right? And you just memorize them, and you're given a test on them, and you can say, oh, I remember that one. I can apply this one here and do this substitution, and then I can apply this other one here and do that substitution, and I get this answer with sine of 2x or something, right? But if you think of all those things as actual operations on a unit circle, or if you think of them as Taylor expansions of a complex valued function, right? Then all of them are evident in entirely different ways, right? The latter is an intuitive understanding of why those things are there, whereas if you just memorize a table of 40 identities and you apply them mechanically, you don't have any intuitive understanding of why these things are true. They're just 40 separate facts. You have no idea why they would cohere together. You can't deduce one from the other. You can't lay out a unit circle and see that that has to be true, right? So that's the kind of distinction he's talking about between signifying knowledge and intuitive knowledge. And as the examples show, this is true even of purely logical things. It's true of purely mathematical things. It's also true of empirical things. His favorite examples of the cases where it's true of empirical things is things which depend upon what I would call formulas of reference. Right? The loser of Waterloo was under 5.5 feet tall, right? This is the kind of thing that you could know if you didn't know anything about the Battle of Waterloo, right? If you managed to decode the first one into a person, it's the person you have to verify it against, right? It's if in an alternative world the French win the Battle of Waterloo and the loser of the Battle of Waterloo is the Duke of Wellington, right? It's no longer true. Right, so you can have there can be contingency of the signifying chain that isn't there in the intuitive chain, right? Cases like that are clear cases where you have only signifying, not intuitive knowledge. You have a bunch of theorems about the positions in the sky of the morning star and the evening star, and you've never noticed they're the same planet. Right? There are lots of cases like this where signifying knowledge has to be distinguished from an intuitive knowledge. Okay, so in all that, the critical thing for him is that how does intuition work? His answer is that intuitions work because they are verifications that an intended sense of things is fulfilled. They have some way of bringing the thing itself before the interior of consciousness in such a way that a set of previous intentions of intended sets of meanings about intended, constructed concepts, so to speak, those intended meanings gel, they fit, they they are fulfilled. There is some image which shows that they are coherent. And the contrast is when you get dissonance instead, when you cannot get your concepts to line up, right? And if you get a dissonance where you cannot get your previous descriptions of meaning to line up, you had some theorem that depended upon the morning star and the evening star being two different planets, and you cannot get that to go through with the fact that they are the same planet, right? Then you get dissonance. Then you get a way in which the thing that you can see directly before your mind cannot be made to gel with your previous descriptions of conceptual intentions, of the meanings of the terms in your reasoning. Okay, and the reason that matters to him is this shows how intentions can be wrong, so to speak, in the sense of not coherent. And his claim is, but intuitions aren't. Intuitions are the verification layer we use to determine whether or not our intended meanings are coherent or not. So in that sense, intuitive knowledge is our well, the later people would put it as it is our access to being. It is the place where the consciousness is before being itself. So in that sense, it is the standard of truth. That which is intuitively evident to us and our standard of truth coincide for Husserl, even in matters of logic and math, because he's not, talking about those things only for a particular realm of the empirical or something like that. He's talking about it in the interior of consciousness itself in ways that are also true for how we verify truths of logic, how we verify truths of math to ourselves. Okay. So
another thing that
go ahead.
comes to mind at this point is when I was taking high school physics, and we'd have an exam coming up, and all my high school friends would say, "How long did you study for that exam?" And I said, "About 20 minutes." And they say, "Why?" I said, "There's two equations on the exam. If I know the two equations, then I can solve any problem that he's going to give us on the exam." And they're sitting there saying, "No, I got to work 30 problems. I got to work all the problems again. I got to make sure I know all the problems." And I said, "No, you just need to know the equation." And I've come to, identify that as being more intuitive, to look just the underlying equation, which tends to tie it back to Jung and the difference between getting caught up in all the sensations versus looking at the root, looking at the intuitive aspect, looking at, oh, the one or two equations are going to be on the test.
I'm going to partly agree with you, but for Husserl, your method could have worked even at the level of significant knowledge if it's just a full understanding of the syntactic rules of those equations, if I can put it that way. You can think of those, how to put it, you can know the wave equation in the sense of knowing the equation itself, and you can know the wave equation in the sense of knowing what it represents, right?
Yeah.
And being able to imagine what it means, and being able to see examples of what it means, right? Yes, you also have to be able to work with the formalism, but the ability to not just play with the formalism, right, but also to see at each of those steps what the formalism is saying and means, that's the intuitive knowledge level, if I can put it that way. So if you have,
that would create a real problem. That would create a real problem in quantum physics with the just shut up and calculate people.
yes, the claim would be that exactly they do not have intuitive knowledge of it. It may be that they can, but they don't have intuitive knowledge of that. If they just shut up and calculate, they have syntactic or representational knowledge only. Joe?
Okay, good distinction. Thanks.
Yes, I actually have personal experience of that, because at the university, I had great difficulty oftentimes when the teacher was presenting things using equations, but in a big way,
Mm-hmm.
Because when I look at an algebraic formulation on a whiteboard, I am illiterate. I do not know what it means. But a good friend of mine, who in fact was very interested in Husserl in ways that mystified me until recently, like last month, would take me off and we'd go to a coffee shop, and he'd simply give me this intuitive level of understanding what it's all about.
Yep.
After I had that, I could read that equation as easily as I could read English,
Right.
but I couldn't do it beforehand. So it's a matter of which level you're going and how it's formalizing.
Yeah, and there are educators who are good at conveying that, and there are others that just can't, right? I mean, I recall TAing for people teaching math, you know, and do a 151 level math course, and the teacher's fine, and the students are all getting it, and do a 131 level math for poets version of the course, and the teacher is poor, and you know is expecting people to just apply things mechanically, and half of the students are lost, and you know. Because they don't have that intuitive, they have no intuitive guide rails to latch onto, and the deeper they get into the subject, the more their understanding of it becomes purely through signification, chains of signification, chains of signs, right? Okay. By the way, this is a whole subject matter that later has a kind of giant afterlife in postmodernism and deconstruction, because the stuff in Husserlian phenomenology about intentions and meanings and the intuitive level is what verifies it gets equated by people like Derrida with the notion of an authorial intention in writing. And what Derrida is all about is upsetting those chains. He wants to read only the words on the page and give them any sense he can put on them, which most people would call intentional misreading, right? But what he's trying to show is that the writing itself has a freedom or play with respect to any such semantics, any such semantic intentions. So for Husserl, systems of signs only communicate because we can have this empirical verification back to the original thoughts behind them sort of level, and that's what he regards as meaningful truth, right? And Derrida making writing rather than thought the primary term here is all about deliberately upsetting that, right? It's trying to deliberately upset that semantic meaning anchor of what the systems of signs on the page have to mean, and claiming that they can mean something else to a reader who reads them with a willfully different semantic interpretation. Anyway, anyway, the point is that, and that's, by the way, one of the reasons that Derrida was, of the people in this sort of continental camp, one that was in some ways more attractive to some of the positivist and later Anglo-Saxon school analytic philosophers, because there's the same focus on the pure syntax of the system of signs in both of them, and on questions of interpretation that gives rise to. So, you know, Klein is thinking about the same things from the standpoint of pure logic and theories, at the same time that that Derrida is thinking about this in terms of the sort of, is there any intention in writing that the reader is bound to conform to when reading, something like that. And Husserl and all that is firmly on the side of the anti-deconstruction version of that, right? He thinks if you're not following the authorial intention, so to speak, his semantics, his meanings, his intentions, that you're just going to be lost, and you're just going to, the results are going to be just absurd. You simply are substituting one term for another in the course of the reasoning, and where the only coincidence between them is, you know, some accident of the signs, if I can put it that way. Okay, so that's just a foreshadowing of sort of how these same problematics with a very different take on them were sort of taken up later. But that also may help understand sort of what Husserl was talking about with intuition. Intuition is, for Husserl, intuition is what you need to be a good reader in the non-deconstructionist sense of one who can follow the semantics of the original author and arrive at the same intended thoughts that he wanted you to think, right? So he's giving you a recipe for what counts as non-deconstructionist reading in a way. And then Derrida will challenge whether or not you want to even do that. But how to do that, Husserl is about. Okay, so signifying acts, objectifying acts, there's a bunch of other levels of problem that Husserl has to deal with here. It's sometimes hard to see all the different things he's kind of arguing against along the way, but one of them, which Levinas brings out towards the end of the last of our 3 chapters, is sort of the contrast with the all truth is at the propositional level people, if I can put it that way. Ever since Aristotle, there's been the claim that you only arrive at the level at which something can be true or false when you arrive at the level of the proposition, right? You've got, the chair is brown, right? You have an object and you predicate something of it in a complete sentence, and at that point you have something which can be true or false, right? And the claim from Aristotelian logic onward is that before you're at the level of the proposition, you don't have true or false. Okay, and if you look at this from the standpoint of language, this makes a certain sense. The individual terms that go into a proposition don't have truth values, only the full sentence does. Okay, but that's because you're looking at it in terms of at the level of terms, at the level of words, right? If you're looking at it at the level of the things to which the words are referring, which is what Husserl is doing, his claim is truth occurs well before the level of the proposition. There can be true perception, for example. This is his characteristic claim, right? A true perception of some external object is not simply the ability to formulate a bunch of propositional statements about it that happen to be true, right? It's getting a whole bunch of things right about the state of the object, so to speak. And for Husserl, the level of truth starts whenever the consciousness can have being immediately before it and can verify what it sees in that. So that includes perceptions. It includes perceptions of logical facts or mathematical facts, but it's not something which is only true at the level of propositions. Why does this matter for Husserl? It matters for Husserl because he's turning around which thing is paradigm for which, right? A lot of the logicians thought the paradigm of logical truth that you get in truths of propositions is the paradigm of all truth. It's almost a definition of truth. And Husserl is saying, no, we only know what true counts as in logical propositions and mathematical propositions because we are comparing the way in which those things are intuitively evident to us to the kind of intuitive evidence that we have from perception. And being before the intended being itself and getting the whole thing bodily there in one blow, right, is what we mean by intuitive knowledge in either case. So perception is closer to being something which can have immediate truth in it than the skeptics would like, but in a way more essentially for Husserl, it means that the way in which logical truths are true is a derivative thing. It's not the paradigm of all truth. It's something that you have to verify is the case from a different prior definition of truth or understanding of truth. Okay. This also leads to the other place where there's a bunch. I should probably pause and give people a chance to react and ask questions to that, but I just want to quickly mention what's special about logic for Husserl here. It's what he calls the formal level. This is another place where, just like intuition can give trouble because he's using it in a special sense, form for Husserl doesn't mean the same thing that it means for Plato, for example. He doesn't just mean an abstract idea, and he doesn't mean every possible abstraction. He doesn't mean chains of genera, for example, genera and species. Hierarchies like that are for him abstract ideas, but they're not forms. For him, what he means by the formal is a truth is only formal if it remains true with every possible replacement of its terms, right? So it's true from the form alone. You can take every variable that occurs in it and replace it with some other variable and it will remain true. So things which are purely syntactic truths of logic fall into this category. Things about part and whole, things about conjunction, ifs and thens, and ands and ors, and how those distribute, right? All these sort of basic truths of formal logic are for him formal. They're not just general, they're beyond general. They're true of anything you put in there. In that sense, they are formal truths, formal realities of thought or something like that. And the way that we can verify those, we can get to in a second, but something formally true, something generically true are two different things. You could have a truth about all numbers, which would require that the thing you're talking about be a number, right? That wouldn't be a formal truth in his sense. It's only a formal truth if it doesn't care what kind of thing you're talking about. If it's true of every x, regardless of what x is, it can be a formal truth. If it's only true for x if x is a number, then it might be a very general truth for numbers, but it still depends upon this something about that to which it is applied, and therefore there's it is informed by a semantic matter, so to speak. It's not simply formal. Okay, so that's just the distinction between the formal and other notions of abstract. It's sort of the highest level of abstract is where you have logic, only logic itself. All right, pause to give people a chance to react to those things.
So does that, his formal logic takes us up to what's sort of kept getting moved up to category theory in a sense, where they started out with set theory, they started out with graph theory, then they moved it all up to category theory and think they've got the end all be all there.
Yes, I mean he actually calls the layer that understands the purely formal logic sense of truths categorical reasoning, right? Not even categorical, but categorial. The intuitive categorial reasoning is what is used in logic. And the kind of logic he's thinking about is very much sort of Frege's formal logic kind of stuff. His first book before all this was on foundations of arithmetic, and his logical investigations book is all about attacking all of the psychologists in logic that Frege was also fighting against around the same, well, a little bit earlier, honestly, in the case of Frege. But anti-psychologists in logic, because logic is a prescriptive normative theory about formal truth, an area of formal truth, not an empirical fact about human psychology, right? That's sort of basic point of logical investigations. So I think that it's fair to say that much of what was formal logic in his day did become, it's not even just became set theory. A lot of the same notions are there in set theory. Set theory is a kind of a distillation of much of it, but there are other things in set theory which would not simply fall into categorical intuition in his sense. There are things in set theory which are designed to be, if I can put it this way, about objects of a certain kind in a way that is that has a kind of matter to it and therefore is more math-like to Husserl than purely formal. But those might be relatively isolatable in the case of set theory. You might be able to say, it's only this one axiom over here that is has actually got matter in it as opposed to just being purely formal. But yeah. Okay, so I hope that has laid out a bunch of what he means by intuition. We've the 3 chapters we're supposed to go over is intentionality, theoretical consciousness, and intuition itself. And we should probably go through those in layers. I have to give everybody a chance to give me their first reaction to the reading though, because so far this has all been introductory, and I want to get a cup of coffee. So I'll be right back. As I brought my headset with me, I can tell you we should start with initial reactions. And in the case of Joe and Craig, that's going to be to the reading.
Well,
For Jim,
Craig just left the room. I'm here.
Okay, great.
I did have a question, but it's slightly naive and off subject. Because
I'm going to go to the bathroom too. Hold on 1 second. I want to hear your question, Joe. Okay, I'm sorry. It won't take 2 seconds. 1 sec.
I'll repeat it.
It might take 2 seconds.
Well, has to do with Heidegger.
Okay, yes.
I guess it starts with the question of, did Heidegger have a different idea of truth and reality and things like that than Husserl? I would be surprised if the answer is affirmative. But that's because I thought, well, he's not back yet. About 2 months ago, I was puzzling over how did Heidegger solve the problem that when you stopped actually being aware of something, looking at the table or something, and turned your focus away from it, how do you know it's still there, that it really exists? And he handled it very well. And for Heidegger, it seems to relate back to the fact that you can make an assertion or a claim in language about the table. And that, now I've lost my train of thought as to exactly how that logically fits, but it struck me as
that's almost at the level of state of affairs, but
exactly. And so that if there's any variance between Husserl and Heidegger, I'm satisfied because I'm not puzzled anymore, as it were.
Right.
More to learn, but not puzzled.
So the first, I want to just quickly react to your question. So first of all, just repeat your question for Jim, right? He's asking about whether or not the notion of truth that we see in Husserl and the notion of truth that we get in Heidegger are the same or are different, and how, right? And I would put it this way: Heidegger is starting from the same place that Husserl was, about truth occurring before the level of the proposition, right? Truth being possible at the level of the perception or the intuitive or the immediate experience of being, so to speak. He is definitely agreeing with Husserl that the characteristic experience that makes truth itself possible is that the consciousness is before the beings. It has the beings themselves directly before it. So on that point, there is complete agreement. Heidegger thinks he sees versions of that in early Greek thinking as well, and he thinks of it as something which has been covered over or forgotten in various ways from Aristotle down to Husserl. Because of this, I'm going to put it this way, this valorization or fixation on the truths of propositions, or the truths of the propositional layer, and not the grounding of those truths of propositions, or the whole propositional layer, in the experiential layer, which he sees Husserl as having reestablished. But from Heidegger's point of view, he looks back over the history and he thinks the early Greeks already had this same intuition of the truth layer and the experiential layer being united, and that thought was already there in thinking and being are the same in Parmenides, for example, but that as the sort of linguistic explanations of truth and logic ramified with Aristotle and afterwards, it came to obscure that understanding. And truth came to be viewed as a more abstract thing and a less immediate thing, as farther removed from experience and more only found in logic or language. Okay, so far, Heidegger is just a student of Husserl who is agreeing with Husserl and going in the same direction, and entirely agrees with Husserl's criticism of the folks who thinks that truth is about propositions only, right? On that point, they're in entire agreement. The place where Heidegger winds up being specifically different from Husserl is for Heidegger, the most important structures of lived experience are not simply theoretical ones. They are structures of care rather than structures of perception. So both of them kind of agree on the intentional acts of consciousness stuff. Heidegger is going to view those intentional acts of consciousness as being way more motivated in a practical sense, and way less sort of conceptually free than Husserl did. Husserl viewed that layer of reason as being something which was fundamentally just part of the free spontaneity of reason. You could shift your attention to anything you cared to shift your attention to, and the theoretical insights you arrived at were the critical thing. And as we'll get to some of the things later in the intuition chapter, even a belief that all of the intuitive experiences that result in a full sense of evident truth are founded on a presentation or a representation of some kind. That's what you find in Husserl, right? And in Heidegger, instead, the base layer isn't something like a representation layer. The base layer is a care layer. It is a layer of motivated, intentional possibilities for my actions, significances to me layer. So that's the particular difference. And it's in a way, some ways you can view that as a deepening of Husserlian analysis of the pre-conscious life, pre-theoretical consciousness, right? Something like that. And Levinas makes the point here along the way that Husserl may have unduly stressed the importance of the theoretical layer of consciousness, in part because of the people he was arguing against, but in part because phenomenology was young. From Husserl's point of view, Heidegger is taking steps which are much less sure, logically speaking, much less grounded in things you can immediately verify and connect to, rationalist understanding. So Husserl was not entirely a fan of where Heidegger went with his stuff, if I can put it that way. But that's the kind of characteristic difference between them. On this basic point about the truth occurs at an experiential layer long before you get to the truth of propositions, they're in entire agreement. Great question. So I wanted to give Craig a chance for first reactions to the reading, or questions for me, either about the stuff we talked about or the reading, or just first reactions to the reading.
The kind of reaction I had was left me with a number of questions, and I need to frame that from the standpoint of another person I've been digging into that I really like. Comes a little bit later, Nikolai Hartmann.
Okay.
And the question as I started looking at this is it's very human centric. The way Husserl seems to present it, consciousness seems to be a uniquely human aspect, and he doesn't deal with the other parts of nature where there is likely intentionality within many living beings, but is it a conscious intentionality, or can we even say, or is he only limiting himself to humans because that's all he can talk about? So that was the part that kind of left me.
Quick responses, right? So we can get to your other stuff, but he is not saying that he's not harping on what is specifically human about any of this stuff. He's not making any claims about the interior life of dogs, right? He does definitely have even an animus against the naturalist reduction modeling view that thinks we're only going to understand human consciousness if we understand it in a frame in which it's a causally built thing like other causally built things around it, from which we can see these similarities and these differences, right? He is an opponent of empirical psychology in that sense, not because he doesn't think empirical psychology can be its own thing in its own right. It can be, but because it's not a substitute for philosophy. And he thinks that it is very easy to get all the philosophy things wrong if you expect an empirical science to answer your philosophical questions, right? And for him, everything we know about the interior life of dogs, which would fit in a thimble, by the way, we know in the interior of our consciousness, right? So you better have sorted what is a theory, what is an external reality, what is a logical statement, what is a claim that is an entailment of a hierarchical structure you've put on things. You better have all of that completely clear before you try to look at the dog and impute mental states to the interior of the dog, right? Or you're going to completely foul it up. So he thinks that all the work he's doing is an absolutely necessary prerequisite to doing anything like that other stuff remotely rigorously, and he is skeptical of everybody who tries to jump into it and get it to give them philosophical answers. He thinks they're putting the cart before the horse. So get your understanding of what theories even are and how they function for us right, and then you can worry about whether or not those inform you about something else, about the specific difference or the commonality of human consciousness and, I don't know, a convolutional neural network or a dog brain or anything else you want to try to compare it to. Fundamentally, he doesn't care about those questions very much. And the reason he doesn't care about those questions very much is he doesn't expect them to teach him very much about how actual consciousness works. He thinks that he has much more direct evidence about how actual consciousness works available. And it's like looking away from the experiment to go, after these other sources, right? The experiment is in the lab. It's right in front of you. You have your mind, you have your experiences, you can investigate it if you just pay careful enough attention. And if you instead, go off to some other comparison way of approaching it, you've left the lab building, and you're going to some other department trying to answer the questions of it. You're trying to answer your biology questions with your chemistry set. You're trying to answer your history questions with your the carbon dating you're studying in physics, right? He doesn't expect that to get very far. Does that help?
Yeah, good answer. Yeah, basic question is his definition of philosophy then.
Right.
And,
so
what he focused on.
So some of his earliest programmatic things, philosophy is rigorous science and phenomenology, are about this because he thinks that people are reducing the meaning of philosophy to theory of knowledge or understanding the or pure logic, pretty much, and they are. Most of the positivists around him think that all actual knowledge is scientific knowledge, and they don't see much of a role for philosophy, right? And he thinks instead that he sees plenty of places where, in his day, the logical foundations of math are screwed up. People are ascribing powers to logic which are magical. People are trying to understand math by understanding logic, by understanding empirical psychology, by survey methods or lab experiments on students, right? None of that's going to work from his point of view. It's all backwards, and he sees a kind of snarled crisis of the European sciences in the period from about 1890 to 1935 or so, whose fundamental character is that naturalist theses that don't follow are being misapplied everywhere and are breaking the proper ordering or structure of human knowledge, right? You're not getting progressive elaboration of the basic categories of each of the sciences, and then each of them making progress in its own area. What you're getting instead is a bunch of very confused cross invasions that are fundamentally motivated by bad philosophy, not good science. And he thinks if you get rid of that bad philosophy, that will not restrict any of those sciences in flourishing in their own way. You'll also do things like, put math on a proper foundation, put logic on a proper foundation, et cetera. To him, that's just part of continuing the Enlightenment project in a proper sense. And he does see a giant role for philosophy and all that. He also thinks that tendency, the naturalist tendency, or the psychologist tendency that we talked about in the last time, are both tending to At the same time, they're claiming to be scientizing human life. They are actually enormously narrowing the sphere about which anything like knowledge can tell human beings anything about their lives. And he sees a colossal collapse in respect for science as such resulting. The positivists aren't just messing up other departments of the universities. The students are tuning them out as arrogant idiots who don't know anything about my life. And this is disturbing him. So that's sort of his sort of fundamental programmatic take, and why he's, why he has such a lance to break against naturalism. He thinks that it's a disaster unfolding, not just in terms of the particular fields, but in terms of the entire respect for the Enlightenment project. Okay, go ahead.
That puts it in perspective for me. That was basically the questions I was trying to sort through between reading from numerous other things the best I can and such. So that gets it there. What it is that he's working in within his particular historical perspective. I do find though that actually his opinion of positivism and scientific reductionism is even alive on the streets today, as everybody is so anti-intellectualism, even in our own culture right now. There seems to be an element of that. What do they know about my life? In that,
Absolutely.
and I wrote that's running rampant right now.
Absolutely.
We're seeing the.
I mean, in part because. Sorry, I was going to say, in part because naturalism hasn't really reformed. All that happened is, a continental philosophy school split off from it and went somewhere else. Sorry, go, Joe.
Yeah, it's also frustrating when you see that capital S science has now become like an icon or a religion thing, as people beat you over the head with it. And behind this is naive empiricism and lots and lots of opinions by people that don't have fully tested observations. It's just frustrating and annoying.
Sure. I mean, and one of the points in the previous section about when Levinas was talking about when Husserl was talking about what he sees as the failures of naturalism, the biggest one of them was, if you ask what is the evidence for the psychological reduction that's going to explain logic as a piece of empirical psychology, right? Or as the wags put it, why would logic ever go right when it's only movements in the brain of a bewildered ape, right? That's the sort of psychologist thing he's worried about, right? Husserl's point is that the only evidence for that position is a narrowing of the field of view of which the person doing it was not conscious, right? So there's nothing wrong with having a field of extended being to which you can apply the methods of reasoning of mathematical analysis as your metaform, and then have an empirical science of how extended objects behave and call it physics, right? There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But you have to know that you've previously done those projections of I'm only going to consider things insofar as they are extended things I can understand with the methods of mathematical analysis. And you have deliberately left out everything else about them. And deliberately leaving out everything else about them doesn't mean those other things aren't there at all. It just means you're not looking at them, right? And that's the fundamental point that he's making about intentions and scope, right? The only evidence that the naturalist has that the sense of being that applies in physics exhausts reality is that it's the only thing he is looking at. This is not good evidence, right? So yeah, that's sort of in that fundamental fight over naturalism. I think Husserl's points are extremely strong, right? Whether or not he got all these other things about intuition and intention and being correct, I think he got most of them correct. I think that most of them were, even from the scientific point of view, even from the purely naturalist point of view, most of them were later extensively verified by what we would call cognitive psychology, right? And cognitive psych, in a purely empirical psychology sense, learned tons from the phenomenological movement. Which isn't quite the intention of the project itself, right? But it's if the very psychologism that you are attacking gets most of its important insights from your attacks on it, right? You did a good job, right? You discovered enormous things that they were leaving out they needed to know at the very least. So in that sense, I think phenomenology made significant contributions. Beyond that, Husserl also touched off all these other chains, some of which he's responsible for and some of which he's not. In Heideggerian existentialism, in continental postmodernism, and all kinds of other things that were, in one way or another, derived from his work. And to be fair, work with some others around him, including predecessors. So he's not, he doesn't get complete responsibility for all the things that happen and all those other things, because a lot of those people are disagreeing with him in various ways and so on, and responsible for their own impacts and so forth. But it was definitely a major event in the start of the 20th century that European philosophy divided on this point, so to speak. There were already kind of different streams in the sense that the continental philosophy of the German idealists from Kant to Hegel, or any of those to Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, was already quite distinct from the sort of Anglo-Saxon logical empiricist and utilitarian strand, and so on. There already were those differences, but they certainly became sharper after you get this whole split off of post-phenomenology, continental philosophy, compared to a kind of logic-centric academic Anglo-Saxon philosophy, analytic philosophy. Okay. Although plenty of other things happened in that later tradition too, including ways in which they rediscovered some of the same problematics, which is a subject in its own right. But okay, good first reactions. I want to give Jim, especially because he wasn't here last time, a chance to ask his basic questions, even if we covered some of them last time, about these people or anything. Obviously, it's not about the reading because you didn't do the reading, you didn't have much time. But your basic questions, Jim?
I think most of them, or at this point, were just around understanding the. I think you did a good job of trying to explain how he's using terminology, and setting us up for that. The questions I had were more like, how does that work with? But you were talking about like syntactic representations.
Yes.
I was wondering if that had anything to do with the way that Searle used the Chinese room experiment to talk about AI, because you mentioned AI, kind of things going through my head. I don't know if those are really appropriate for the conversation.
It's a little bit of a stretch, but yes, Searle was trying to make a similar kind of point about a need for an intuitive fullness for full understanding. That's sort of what Chinese room is meant to be about, right?
Yeah.
Another place where some of these things came out in later analytic philosophy would be some of Kripke's stuff about naming an intention. So the famous book is Naming a Necessity by Kripke, and he's making the claim that the way in which we ascribe reference to things when we're naming them has a kind of has necessary entailments which are not simply positivist. What did I say? There was a school of positivism that tried to claim that all of the only things that were going to be necessary were things which were truths of logic, analytics facts, and that there were no necessary truths beyond that, and besides that, you would understand all the philosophical problems as being merely problems of language or of understanding language or misusing language. So if you got rid of all of the language misunderstandings, there were no real philosophical problems in sort of the later Wittgenstein version of this, right? So wanting to reduce philosophy to logic on the one hand and clarifications of the delusions of grammar on the other, so to speak. And that if you did both those things successfully, you were left with logic as a method for sciences in general, and nothing else other than exploding possible errors. And what Kripke was able to show is that there were questions in philosophy that are really more about metaphysics than that are not simply questions of language. Anyway, people have plenty of debates about the particular things that Kripke managed to show. But the point of similarity between Kripke and Husserl is that both of them are dealing with this issue of the stability of reference. In the case of Kripke, your names attached to things. In the case of Husserl, the intended objects of the meaning of your terms in your reasoning, or something like what we would call a semantic model in later terms. And both of them making claims that those things have philosophical commitments, ontological commitments involved in them that are not just illusions of language. Anyway, so the reason I'm bringing those up, Searle is another example, is that some of these same kinds of problems or issues did resurface in different ways in the later analytic tradition. The later analytic tradition didn't just avoid these kinds of questions, but they often didn't come back to them by taking Husserl seriously again. It would like come up somewhere else, right, where the similar kind of problem, less systematically considered, came flying in and worried them, right, or upset some program of simplification that some simplifier had thought had succeeded or whatever. So it would be a caricature to claim that analytic philosophy has no awareness of some of the issues that Husserl raised. It just didn't treat them systematically the way he did. But many of them cropped up later for different reasons. So fair question about the Searle.
Okay. I had just two other ones.
Sure.
One was still on the perception, because that's primarily what I'm talking about. I was wondering, maybe you should go first with history. So there was Husserl, and then Husserl influenced Heidegger, and then Levinas is commenting on phenomenology from the
Levinas is really after Heidegger. He studied with both of them. It would be fair to call him a student of Heidegger who later broke with Heidegger. So each of them has ways of differing from their predecessor. The basic story is that Heidegger agrees with a bunch of the foundations of Husserl, but thinks that Husserl has been too focused on the theoretical consciousness and not enough on the practical consciousness or care. And he, puts things more in the practical life world. And it's also, I think, put it this way, more interested in history and also the ways in which the different consciousnesses differ, especially through time, right? So bringing in the practical and bringing in historical change are the typical Heideggerian extensions to the position you got in Husserl. Levinas is going to bring in, he thinks that he is critical of Heidegger because he thinks Heidegger has left out the ethical too much. There were other earlier phenomenologists like Schiller who had already emphasized the ethical, and Levinas is influenced by them, but he's also just sees specific things that Levinas regards as missing in Heidegger. He thinks Heidegger is too focused on the technological, practical from the individual point of view, and not enough on the communicative, intersubjective aspect of things, put it that way. So the treatment of the way in which Dasein is with the others and being in time is, especially in terms of the inauthentic they self and just being with the others as the they, right? And none of that is the authentic relation to an other as an exchange of truth that you get made most of in Levinas. So in terms of just the progression, Heidegger thinks Husserl is too theoretical and logic oriented and not practical and history oriented enough, and Levinas thinks that Heidegger is still too individualist and too practice oriented and not ethical oriented enough, something like that, or moral oriented enough. But the result is you get these from the outside, people look at that progression and they think there seems to be something a little bit underdetermined or slippery, not to say willful, about where this phenomenology comes out in terms of which structures of the life world are basic, right? It's almost like you can get different flavors of it depending on what you think is most important, and it's not clear that those differences are coming out because this layer or that layer of our actual mental constructions are or are not more basic. It's almost like the philosopher just chooses what he wants to emphasize, and then that looks more basic. So there were plenty of criticisms of phenomenology from outside that saw that the variety there as showing a kind of free play or uncertainty that led people to doubt each one of the analyses individually. Obviously, that doesn't completely follow, right? You can have three people who give different approaches to a problem, and one of them analyzes it right and two others analyze it wrong, and the fact that there are three of them doesn't mean that all of them are wrong. But there are plenty of people who wanted to dismiss having to read, you know, this many thousands of pages of hard philosophy who are looking for such a reason. And they would find the differences between Husserl, Heidegger, and Levinas as reasons to not expect any one of them to follow so certainly from the premises that there was only one place it could come out, something like that. But I think that that's true of all philosophy. That philosophers differ from one another and disagree with one another is, you know, that's what they do. That's what they're for. You shouldn't expect them all to come to the same answer.
Okay. And good, thank you. Then the third question I guess I had was, so with the perception thing, it's hard for me to frame these. I'm trying to see how they work together. When it comes to a signifying event, in an intuitive event, now they're different.
Yes.
What came to my mind was, and this works with also, I guess I'm trying to tie Heidegger with Husserl and see how they, and I don't know how the story ends, so maybe this is too early of a question, but I wondered about Gibson's experiments about visual or his ecological view of visual perception versus the top-down model. And I was thinking of that because, okay, if Gibson's theory has some weight to it, is that a result of siding with Husserl as receiving information from an ambient light source, and instead of taking a retinal image and then modeling a world around that, and how would that work with? That's what I'm trying to figure.
So to be clear, right? So in Husserl, right? There's, you know, the hyletic stream of raw data in the interior of consciousness, right? There, and at another extreme, there is the transcendent intended object outside the consciousness. There's plenty in between. Right? And specifically, he doesn't call these things events. He calls them acts. He thinks there's an activity of the consciousness in these things. The first activity of the consciousness in these things is the finding of the intentional object in the stream of the empirical data, which is a focused extraction. It is an apprehension that is a focused abstraction from the data, so to speak, that organizes it. So there's at the level of the intended objects of consciousness, you're already even in a purely immanent sense, without any exterior referent yet, you already have this kind of constructive, synthetic, abstracting activity, something like that. What you don't get yet in Husserl is the notion that those particular apprehensions are motivated apprehensions that are projections on the action possibilities of that Dasein, which is what you get in Heidegger, right? That those things are to be understood on the structure of care or something like that. Where they will both agree is the sort of background of time that is being used in all of that. The consciousness in Husserl or the Dasein in Heidegger are all time synthesizers of things which are extended objects through time. They are not point takers of instantaneous information, right? The synthetic operations that the consciousness performs on the stream of data aren't restricted to a single instant in time, right? They include an abstraction from the temporal flow, not just an abstraction from the spatial or visual field differentials. They also include synthesizing information from all the senses and all these other kinds of things, right? So things which the older Kantians would have called the synthetic unity of apperception, right? This is that sort of same understanding that same level of activity of the consciousness as this sort of constructive activity is there in all three of them. Sorry, when I say all three of them, I mean your later theory of vision, and it's there in Husserl and it's there in Heidegger, right? The main nuances of difference are, first of all, Husserl is going to differentiate between all those intended things and the transcendental object itself, and he's going to claim that the consciousness is not trying to think about its thoughts. The consciousness is trying to think about the transcended object of those thoughts, and you're not going to understand it correctly if you don't respect that distinction, right? We can put on these different layers of analysis, but thoughts are thoughts about something, and the about something of which they're trying to be thoughts is an ascription of not just meaning, but being and operative, I can put it this way, operative significance to, right, a particular kind of constructed thing. So Husserl is going to insist upon the constructed nature of the objects about which thought thinks. When Husserl says object, he doesn't mean transcendent material particular, right? He means anything that thought thinks about. He means the object pole of a relation of what thought is thinking about. He means that pneumata, as the noesis is knowing about. But the point is, in all that, there definitely is all this construction and time synthesis going on. But, and here's where the intuition layer comes in for Husserl, the things which are extracted in those construction operations are actually there, right? Both in the abstractions we form and in the commonalities we notice in the stream in time and the difference in space of the extended object, and it's persisting through our different perspectives as we shift around it, right? All those things are actually there, and we can have thoughts in which the meaning we intended when we laid down our terms of reference in our constructions and what we verify from our experience directly coincide. We can have intuitive confirmation of our interior conceptual schemes, if you want to put it this way. To put this in terms that a Popperian would understand, the mind is always constructing theories about how the external world works that it is only using its interior experience as evidence for, but it is also fully capable of falsifying or confirming those theories, right? And when they're confirmed, right, we have intuitive understanding. The things seem self-evident to us, right? So he's not Popperian Popperian is, a limited claims position that wants falsifiability, but not the possibility of confirmation. Husserl is not that. He thinks that confirmation is possible in these things, but he thinks that both logical truths, mathematical truths, and empirical truths have this confirmed experience. They have the possibility of the confirmed experience, which is known with evidence. And that sense of known with evidence that intuitive understanding gives is to him the paradigm of truth. It's not something that we later have to ask, does this manage to conform to some later understanding of truth we got from logic? No, it's the basis of any understanding of truth we have about logic. It's why we think anything we think we prove in logic is true. It's because it seems evident to us in the same way that intuitive understanding of perceptual things do. The things we're perceiving are different in logic. The things, not even perceiving is not the right word. The things that we are understanding in logic aren't perceptions, they're abstract things, but we understand them with the same notion of a fullness of intuitive evidence that we do when we understand perceived things. The thing which is difficult for sort of the empiricist to understand about this is that when he says that these that a perceptual intuition can be simply true and can get you before the being itself, he's not saying you, quote, get the whole thing at all of its levels. You don't need to. All these constructions have the character of extractions or extractions from the they're only trying to be true in limited respects about limited things, right? All of these extractions, all of these constructions are in a way limited claims about the full thing perceived. And that's what their meaning is, that's what their being is, that's what their intended object is, right? They're only trying to be truths about X or Y about the object. And if they are, then they're just confirmed and they're just true. Okay, so I don't know if that helps, but
yeah, good. Thank you.
Okay. Joe, do you have immediate questions? You had the first one that was good about the relation to Heidegger, but.
I've been listening along. This is quite interesting. I like, especially as you explained to James, things that we might have covered earlier. My learning is recursive, and so I like going over that stuff too. I'm not bringing anything new forward at this moment, although there's a huge orchard here that I would love to continue to stroll through and pick a fruit from.
Right. So do we understand the different layers of things that there can be thoughts or objects of thought about? Because this is one of the things that is most challenging about Husserl.
That was the most obvious. No, well, that was the most obvious to me, because that's, I was pleased to see that Husserl originated this, if he was the originator, because I've been aware of this different layers of interpretation from the very beginning of my adulthood. Of course, I came into adulthood in the late 60s and began to, discover these things. And the first thing that hit me was that, you could see many events will happen and people might have feelings or reactions to them. But if one looks at it differently with a different information detail or whatever, one forms a different opinion. And that struck me immediately. I mean, very young. And now I'm beginning to see this layers of interpretation can clearly be the source of all of that. However, needless to say, what I just said incoherently also leads one into a postmodernist abyss. And now I'm very interested in deepening my knowledge as to what this is all about, what that is all about. So Heidegger, Husserl, all this stuff is really, really delicious.
Great. Not sure how clear all these levels are. I mean, so the fact that you can have a different subject of the focus of your attention and you're trying to notice a different thing about something, and that as you do that, the perspective or aspect that you emphasize and that someone else emphasizes can be different, and therefore there can be different true assertions about the subject. I don't think he's the only person to have noticed that. I don't think he's, I think other people before him certainly even emphasize that. I think of people like Nietzsche in particular. But what's characteristic about Husserl is that he brings to that a kind of direct connection of it to logical analysis kind of thinking, if I can put it that way. There's lots of people who think that a logical analysis kind of thinking and that thought are, like diametric opposites, right? As though the logical analysis thinking has to be about the whole thing or something, or the objective thing or something, and therefore cannot have different aspects or views about it. Not the case, right? But to me, the thing which is characteristic of Husserl on this is the notion that, well, intentionality. We gotta talk about this intention layer, which is there in a sense in all consciousness. That to me is the characteristic teaching of Husserl. It's the thing which sets him apart from other people who have talked about picking out this aspect or that. Is he thinks of the act of aiming at only aspect X about something has the character of a laying down the meaning of one of your terms in an analysis you are performing. It has the sovereignty of a definition, so to speak, from the standpoint of a nominalist, right? It's like, the mathematician is allowed to tell you what he means by a compact set, on page 2, and then reason in terms of it. And it is obtuse to object to the mathematician on page 38 that you're not allowed to have compact set mean that, right? He gets to lay down the meaning of the terms as he's going to use them in the process of reasoning he's going to construct. And what Husserl has done is he has given that same freedom of ascription of meanings to the primitive acts of consciousness, whereby it basically says this kind of object will be posited as existing and having these properties, right? I reason in terms of this focused, extracted piece of what am I paying attention to, and that thing that I'm paying attention to has the meanings I've given to it. Now, as I reason about it, I may find that my reasonings are my ascriptions are incoherent. I can reach an impasse, right? A logical one or come into conflict with the truth of fact, right? This is where he talks about dissonance, right? So your freely set definitions, right, are still freely set definitions, but they could result in an incoherence either with one another or with a truth of fact. No question. But that doesn't change the fact that you are still free to lay them down any way you wanted, right? It's after the fact that you notice the dissonance. It's not like you have to follow some procedure in laying them down so that dissonance will never be hit or it would not be possible. On the contrary, we just freely ascribe these meanings to the objects of our thoughts, and then if they don't result in any dissonance, we can work in the construction that results, so to speak. And that's to me characteristically Husserlian. And I would even say that a lot of the stuff that later got talked about as structuralism, post-structuralism, the whole notion of structure as the way of thinking about this, to me stems from that. It stems from the construction-making character of consciousness, if I can put it that way, or of reason that you find in Husserl. Now, some of the later structuralists wanted to claim that some of these structures weren't made by individual consciousness. They had, some other kind of intersubjective or objective existence independent of consciousness. Different story, but they still, that they're talking about structures as these mental concept-like things is very Husserlian to me. Husserl just has a very, I put this a kind of a subjective semantics of what structure does. We're not going to get to next time to his whole theory of abstraction, of how we see the general in particulars. That's the intuition of essences chapter. We'll definitely get to that next time. that will bring out all the ways in which Husserl is and isn't a Platonist, right? He kind of is a Platonist in that he sees abstract essences in things. He's not quite a Platonist in that he doesn't reify those. He doesn't reify those conceptual abstractions, so to speak. He gives them their own manner of being and their own categories of truth as abstract that is different from empirical precepts of extended things or something like that. Okay, we've lost 2/3 of the people here.
No, I just had to go to the bathroom.
No problem. Was any of this, this may be for Joe and Craig, although Craig is away at the moment. There's some sections towards the end of the intuition chapter, the end of our reading, where Levinas is trying to contrast what Husserl means with people like Leibniz, Kant, other contemporaries reacting to Husserl's early publications, etc. And I wondered if any of those were Hume even, if any of those were useful or problematic, right? It's hard to tell when a philosopher gives you an illustration like that, whether or not it helped or just raised a whole new set of problems that you don't know about. Sorry, go ahead, John.
For me, they did not raise problems. They were very interesting because, once again, the history of philosophical thought and how these things have progressed. For example, the recent book we did on being through different philosophers through time was very interesting in that regard. This is like a flashback to that same discussion.
That's right. That's right.
And I liked it.
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons why I thought, I mean, this can help tie together a bunch of the things that Husserl is about to that sort of those previous discussions, whether Aristotle, Kant, Hume, Leibniz, right? There are, I'll put it this way, existing problems of the kind that Gilson was talking about that Husserl thinks he is navigating successfully here in a way that is maybe more compelling than the way Gilson thinks his is. But there certainly is a diagnosis of the whole Kant-Hume problem, for example, that we saw in Gilson, and how Levinas thinks Husserl has successfully navigated that. And what navigates it successfully from Husserl / Levinas's point of view is that the notion that the base layer of truth is logical statements, logical judgment, right, is just dropped at the beginning, right? Truths about logical judgment are a derived thing about how we can know abstract stuff that you need a whole theory to even reach and see, right? But the nature of evidence in logical deduction or proof is the same kind of intuitive evidence that we have already in perception. So whereas Kant wants to construct how perceivables are perceivable on the basis of a set of requirements that fundamentally stem from logic, right? Husserl is, on the other way around, going to be saying, you can only tell that a truth in a step in logic is true because it is conforming to a standard of intuitive truth that you got from perception, right? Go ahead, Joe.
This looks very much like an analogy I once heard earlier, that if you're going to build a cathedral, you need to put up all that scaffolding. Okay, but once you have the cathedral, you take the scaffolding down, you see the beauty of it. Now, the level that Kant was trying to do, he was trying to resurrect all the scaffolding to build the whole damn thing. Whereas Husserl was starting by saying, there's the building. Now, what possible scaffolding could have been put here? and he's seeing how, and it comes up from the top down. And I think this is an interesting view of the same thing from 2 points of view.
Perhaps,
Maybe
but there's also a definite difference here. I mean, in a way, the diagnosis that Levinas gives is that Kant is in a way trying to keep alive a dream of rationalism, where rationalism is meant in a particular sense. Rationalism in a particular sense is the idea that all the contents of the world could be constructed by pure reason in a chain of logical deduction if you had the right premises to start from, something like that. And in order to keep that dream alive, after you realize that there are sort of standards of what objects are and how they can appear that are, sort of necessary truths of possible experience that don't seem to be logical at all, but seem to be synthetic. Things about the nature of space, the nature of time, and so forth, that seem to be necessary qualities of our judgment, but that don't seem to be things which you can just derive from, the principle of contradiction in the non-contradiction, I mean, in the Leibnizian sense or something like that. That to Kant is a problem, right? So he's trying to show you how, it could be something about the nature of the mind itself that, does all that construction, and that's the actual constraint, something like that. But all of that is still trying to find a world that is so rationally constructible that if you knew its interior principles, you could deduce it in a way. And compared to all of that, Husserl is way more empirical. He's way more going back to the evidence. And the evidence is the evidence of how we actually think in the interior consciousness. And if you start at that end, if you start on the empirical end of things, you start at the life experience end of things instead of the prior presumption of the logical constructibility of the world, what you discover is logic is a particular kind of reasoning that we engage in that is a very special case because it's the kind of reasoning about objects as such that doesn't care what they are. And that's where we get abstract logic from. It's the things which we know with the same evidence that we know things about perceptibles in lived experience that are true at a level of generality beyond generality where they're purely formal, right? They are true of any x. And the same standard of truth we use in perception being applied to laws of that character is how we know that our logical systems are consistent, or that the truths that their deductions are truth preserving, right? That's Husserl's claim. So he's very much starting from the interior lived experience evidence ends of things without any prior assumption about the logical constructibility of the world, and he's arriving at something like a trustworthiness of logic as an inference or a deduction, a perhaps heroic inference, but an inference, right? And one of the reasons he's doing that is because he's taking on these empirical psychologists who are, trying to claim that, logic is just the particular evolved accidental rules about how this, this bewildered ape thinks, right? And he's like, no, that's not what logic is at all. And your sciences will fall apart if you try to construct them on that basis. Right. So to me, the meat of that stuff, which is the stuff we see repeated in Heidegger, and people have asked about it already, is stuff on page 88 where it says his transformation of the concept of truth is based on his concept of consciousness, and it is in this presence of consciousness to objects that the primary phenomena of truth lies. Right. So the sense that we get in Heidegger, as we saw before, that truth is the appearing of the beings to the Dasein, right? That's what we mean by truth. That is founded on this aspect of Husserl. And that is itself founded upon this notion of evidence within lived experience as what truth has to anchor to, right? If there aren't evidentiary experiences in lived experience, there isn't truth. but there are. But that means that truth is something that happens in certain evidentiary experiences within lived experience. That's how truth happens. Anyway, that to me is sort of the, in a way, the deepest result of Husserl, in the sense that it's the place where this, what we later think of as a characteristically Heideggerian turning over of a traditional concept of truth into a more experiential concept of truth, right? Heidegger didn't invent that. Husserl invented that. Heidegger may have also found signs of it in the pre-Socratics, so in that sense, maybe Husserl wasn't the first one to invent that, but at least in the 20th century, Husserl at least reinvented that. So to me, that's the fundamental divide between what I can call the truth is only something which happens at the level of propositions logic philosophy over here, and the truth is something evident within the stream of lived experience over here, right? And that those two different senses of truth, to me, divide the later philosophical history of Western philosophy into the analytic proposition truth camp and the phenomenological existentialist lived experience appearing truth camp. Go ahead, Joe.
Yes, I always have to double check the microphone is turned on. Prior to starting the Husserl book, of course, we spent about a half year on Heidegger's discussion of Nietzsche.
Yep.
And I'm suddenly wondering, where did Nietzsche fit into this? It's almost like he was a tornado that swept through philosophy. And when he blew away, we're back to the basics of what people were doing for centuries ahead of him. I mean, I appreciate how overturning of things he was, because oftentimes I think, yeah, you're just making that up. You're just positing your own value there and blah, blah, blah. And I can see how free and easy and dangerous that becomes for an undisciplined mind. But aside from Heidegger's basically eventually bringing us at the end of the Nietzsche book back to the ground, saying, well, that was Nietzsche and here's his mistakes, and leaving us there, that's good. But was Nietzsche even more important in the long run into the 21st century, or has he sort of blown over?
Great question. So the funny thing is that Nietzsche is on both sides of these divides, right? And depending on how you look at it in a way, I mean, there are definitely things in Nietzsche which are so naturalistic and so psychologistic that they are very much of the logic is only movements in the brain of the bewildered ape school of thought, right? He can be read in a purely sort of naturalist way in that sense, and the sort of later logic folks might like the fact that puts them on the opposite side of that Husserl distinction. But anyone who is going with cognitive science versions of naturalism and is not listening to any of Husserl's critiques of naturalism in that sense could easily see Nietzsche as a forebear, because Nietzsche is the guy who says that he's going to emphasize the non-conscious aspects of thinking, the subconscious aspects of thinking, the embodied and evolved nature of thinking, all of those things. And in that sense, all of the sort of later cognitive psych people are Nietzscheans, right? They're following in that same tradition, and they are brushing off this critique of naturalism from people like Husserl, and confidently striding on with their naturalism anyway, right? With their reductionisms anyway. At the same time, Nietzsche is also the guy who says we should, if we viewed the world entirely from the inside, we would see it as this this functional life world, and not as this abstract physical thing, right? The world viewed from the inside would collapse the distinction between the real world and the apparent world. The apparent world would be the only world that there is, So we would get rid of all of our looking for mechanisms behind the world Platonism, and we would live in the stream of immediate experience, which is sort of where phenomenology starts and kind of where Heidegger's life world seems to end. So you can see the whole phenomenological tradition as being the world viewed as the inside pole of Nietzsche's thought. It's the constructing a world in which the entire world is the merely apparent world, because consciousness is what we have to live in, right? So the idealistic subjectivist pole of Nietzsche can easily be seen as being of the same tissue as phenomenology or later existentialism. So Nietzsche is in a way perfectly compatible with both the existentialist post-Husserlians and the naturalist people who were disregarding Husserl, right? And partly this is why Nietzsche is so influential. He's kind of got a foot in both camps. He appeals in different ways to people in both those traditions, and those traditions may be less at war with each other than they think, because they can, in some ways, be two sides of the same divide that analyzes the world the same way, of a naturalist considered objective science and a subjectivist considered true of the life world idealism, in uneasy, unresolved tension with one another, right? So the different poles of Nietzsche mirror the divisions in the later philosophies, and mirror the different interpretations of psychology. So I consider Nietzsche influential on all of these traditions without anyone actually directly following him. Well, I can't say without anyone, because some of the postmodernists do directly follow him. People like Foucault are best understood as, just running with Nietzsche, rather than some of the other later people in either of these traditions. Yeah, he is not the forefather of only one side of either of these traditions. Neither of these traditions can claim that they are, the continuation of Nietzsche's thought alone. Nietzsche's thought influences them on both sides of the divide, so to speak. That also means that people on both sides of this divide would have violent disagreements with Nietzsche. There's plenty of, the cognitive science people would have violent disagreements with the subjectivist side of Nietzsche, and consider, his views about embodied mind as being, pseudoscientific, and not nearly as scientific and rigorous as they are, right? And from the other side, we already saw in our work before that, someone like Heidegger will think that Nietzsche is way too much of a metaphysician in a reductivist sense, so to speak. But yeah, so yet another way of thinking about this is in Nietzsche, we already had the idea that the mind constructed the world with this useful for it categorizations that he didn't think were nearly as truth-preserving or necessary as Kant thought they were, right? But they were just kind of arbitrary guess constructions, which might be completely wrong, but they were the delusions that we lived within. Someone can give that kind of a reading to Husserl. They can think that Husserl has completely described their life world, but that all the things he's described about it don't have to be true. It's maybe what this bewildered ape deludes himself into thinking that is true, but it can put all of that not in a Husserlian set of epoche brackets, but put them in a Nietzschean set of this is how bewildered apes thinks bracket, right? So multiple moves like that are possible, but did Nietzsche just have no impact on all these things because the impact could be multifaceted? I think the answer is no. I think he did have an influence on all of these folks. He had influences on Jung and the ideas of the unconscious. He had influences on Husserl's focus on the life world as the world of lived experience has to be the true world because we don't have access to a different Platonic one. He had influence on the cognitive science people, etc. the people who he probably influenced the least were the pure logicians. They didn't care about Nietzsche. Except to the extent that they were, like Frege, antagonistic to anything that tried to psychologize logic. And in that sense, they should be on the same side as Husserl, but they're not, because they don't like his anti-naturalism. It's funny that, because the logician school, the Frege to Russell school, if I can put it that way, are on the one hand very much anti-psychologists in logic, but on the other hand, they're entirely pro-naturalist in other respects, which ought to give them more of a problem than they face up to, right? They just try not to think about that one. I'm going to pause. Go back to recording. Any other questions about this stuff? I don't know if we're running out of subject matter, if I've not covered everything.
So one other question that came up when I was kind of thinking through some of this stuff too was we've dealt pretty much with the naturalist aspect in terms of
Yes.
animals and other things like that. Go into the other direction, the social and cultural impacts. Would a Native American Indian, sure. Aborigine, Chinese, would they come to the same conclusions if they follow Husserl, or is he strictly within the European realm?
Right. So I mean, some of these is like, Sapir-Whorf kind of questions about translatability of things, and does this Hopi person have the same sense of time consciousness that you'll find in the phenomenology of internal time consciousness and so forth? Husserl is deeply skeptical of all claims that all those things are culturally relative and different. Right? He is an Enlightenment rationalist. He is not claiming that these things are only true of European thought. And if someone tries to tell him that the nature of consciousness that he has described isn't true of my consciousness, he's, if he's being polite, he might smirk, right? He doesn't believe you. He thinks you're making it up, right? Now, people like Heidegger are much more focused on the ways in which some of these things could be both motivated practically and subject to historical change, if not necessarily cultural difference, but to historical change. That really comes after Husserl. Husserl thinks he's analyzing things which are true of consciousness as such, and he doesn't think that these things are going to be different from one person analyzing them to another. He's not focused on a personal difference kind of thing here. He's thinking of all this as there are different ontologies for different areas of science, and there's different notions of existence for an empirical layer and a logical fact and a fact of mathematics and so on, right? He's got plenty of room for variety of that kind in meanings. And the way in which he sees meaning as arising does have a role for the acts of consciousness in it. But he doesn't think that any human being organizes their life world experience into transcendent objects that are intended as the things which they are ascribing reality and meaning to. He's not expecting that to be any different from one human being to another. And if you tried to tell him, I don't see objects, I see, the negative space around objects only, right? He would just laugh you out of court, right? He would think that you were just lying. There are even places in Husserl where he almost asks rhetorical questions of, if I had the full sense of this intuitive object appearing to me, how could anyone else not have it, right? So he's not anything like a Nietzschean or a Nietzschean relativist in that sense. What else? The place where he does emphasize these, the differences of meanings, the differences in all the careful time distinctions, etc. He thinks those are facts of the nature of consciousness itself. I wouldn't say he's quite as universalist about them as, say, Kant is, but he's closer to how universal Kant is about the structure of the transcendental ego or something than he is to even a Heidegger about those things being different at different eras of philosophical thought. So basically, he's not a relativist, and it's useful to know that the origins of phenomenology have nothing to do with relativism. Fair question.
Yeah, same kind of issue with regard to language. If there were different linguistic structures, would they affect the perceptions?
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that Husserl is more of an intuitive visual thinker than a linguistic one. He thinks the linguistic layer is precisely the layer of the signifying, which he thinks he has shown is a derived sense of meaning, and he thinks people are so focused on the linguistic layer because they are fixated on the proposition as the site where truth happens. And his whole point is that's just not the case. The signifying layer is the inauthentic understanding of things. The understanding of things that you only have mediatedly through language is how you try to communicate them at what he calls the level of the logos to others, where you have to have repackaged them in a form that's communicable enough across the gap, the one mind to another mind gap. The other person only fully understands them if he verifies those things with his own intuitive contents, which he can't do if he stays at the signifying layer alone. So he is so far from thinking that language is the level of thought that he thinks that language has to compress and distort the level of thought below the level at which truth actually happens in order to use oral signs to communicate. And if someone correctly understands what someone else says, they're doing it because they can look through the oral signs to the actual intended objects that the other person is referring to independently. So unless you can translate from his words to my thoughts, you cannot understand with full understanding. And he doesn't think that's a problem across languages. He thinks that's a problem even within language. This, by the way, is why people like Derrida will, disagree with how semantic and intentional all this is violently, right? They want the level of language, not even the level of language, the level of writing with all of its syntactic and ambiguity and all of its purely signifying nature to be controlling. And they don't want there to be any more authentic, truthful semantic layer underneath it, right? But that's in that divide, Husserl is entirely pre-deconstructionist. He is entirely valorizing the level of the intuitive understanding against the level of the purely signifying system, right? And there were lots of later thinkers that were, all about denying that that can matter or denying that that is, stable or has reference or something like that, and trying to claim that the signifying layer with all its ambiguity is the actual controlling intersubjective thing or something like that. And they're playing the same kind of naturalist move of that intersubjective signaling system is real and these other things are too ideal to be real, something like that. They'll claim that the signifying system is objective in the same and real and external and verifiable and and so forth, and that all of these subjectivist intuitions of Husserl are not the way you get to a fullness of a true understanding, but are just untranslatable, uncommunicatable, private experiences that aren't real in the sense of shareable across minds. My sympathies in that one are, by the way, my sympathies with that are all on Husserl's side of that, but that isn't obvious. But
yeah, sorry, the other piece that comes up is looking at some of the work on art criticism and such on the indeterminacy and the levels of indeterminacy left in art would tend to say that those are relative, they are a different level than what Husserl's getting to. Then.
Sure. This is, I mean, the same problematic is brought up by Heidegger in The Origin of the Work of Art, right? And it's made much of by Derrida on the notion of writing itself, right? This idea that the produced thing is produced as a produced thing at the level of sign, and that what is communicated by the sign depends upon the intentional reading of the reader, not the authorial intention of the producer of the work of art or the author of the writing in the two cases. So that whole problematic of the work of art or of writing was definitely, emphasized strongly later on, in the case of Heidegger, with an intention that allowed the possibility of authentic experience of being itself, so to speak, and still had this sense of, if you reproduce that communication, if you reproduce the contact with being itself, you have truly understood the work of art, something like that, in some authentic sense. But that it is always going to be a challenging thing. He had the same, Heidegger had the same notion of how the audience reinterprets the work of art as how a later thinker reinterprets an earlier one, right? So his paradigm for this is the assimilation or destruction of a tradition in thought. That's his paradigm for how the different audiences experience the work of art in Heidegger. But that still has a notion of a changing but still authentic understanding, right? And Derrida is precisely going to, just throw out the possibility of an authentic understanding. From the standpoint of any of these guys, for Derrida, all readings are inauthentic, willful suppositions or willful reimaginings, so to speak. And the syntactic thing that is created, that is written, always escapes any intention that can be, or any semantics that can be thrown onto it. And Derrida does not say this in a tragic sense of, oh, the thing has failed to perform as it was expected. This is to him a consummation devoutly to be wished, because it means that syntactic systems escape the tyranny of their originators, that they are freely and democratically reinterpreted by their audience, something like that. But yes, this is the same. You're right to bring this up, as it's the same kind of problematic of the notion of writing, the notion of the work of art, and it's changing historical meaning or its original intention. That continuum was played on. The changes in that were played on post Husserl by later folks in that tradition. Not always in the same direction, but it's safe to say that Husserl was, in a way, almost naively more interested in a fidelity to the original intuitionist intention of the creator of any communication than the later folks were. If that helps.
Yeah, can I chime in with
Sure.
this?
Sure.
So how does this, Craig mentioned art, and you're talking about literature, I guess. With music, we're the only species that can entrain to an isometric source beat outside of ourselves. And it seems like music probably evolved before language. Mm-hmm. How does that work with Husserl's view? I'm seeing maybe that's the underneath thing that he's getting at, is sure. Underneath even the when
Husserl's favorite examples of time consciousness are all musical, right? When he's trying to explain how we recognize a tone or what a melody even is, right? These are his paradigm examples of time extended objects of reference, right? When he wants to show that our objects of reference are not things which are point-like in time, but are extended in time, and so are our thoughts about them. And that means that within the immanent layer, we have time synthesis, constructions. Music is his paradigm example for doing that. This, by the way, is the book that covers those kinds of things. If you want to know the phenomenology of internal time consciousness. And that was this is heavily influential on being in time, right? There's lots of things about, in presenting of a having beenness that you find in both basic problems of phenomenology and being in time in Heidegger that are, indebted to this. I think there's a section early on when they're, see what I have it here. Yes. Like on the second page, right, he says, this analysis was presented very briefly by Marty in his paper on the development of the sense of color, right? The time when he's writing this book, Marty with a Y, first name basis, means Martin Heidegger sitting in the seminar room, right? So to understand the degree of reference you're going to get there, the degree of influence rather you're going to get there. How does this relate to things like the origin of the work of art? Heidegger is influenced by this time consciousness understanding, but he is also influenced by all these things in Nietzsche about the world as a work of art giving birth to itself kind of understanding. And there's a whole volume that we didn't read of the Heidegger and Nietzsche stuff, which is about that world as a work of art. This is the notion of the life world as something constructed in Nietzsche, constructed in the sense of made, in the sense of poetic production. And what you get in Husserl is this notion of constructed, which is not viewing it as poetry at all, but it's almost like a mechanical spontaneity of the human mind, something like that. Heidegger winds up being influenced by both these things, and when he writes things like the origin of the work of art, he's sort of putting those together, along with kind of his own understanding of the nature of history or tradition, if I can put it that way. But if you want a good primer on this, reading Heidegger on the origin of the work of art, which is in his collected basic writings, that red cover book, if you look for it. It's a challenging essay, but it's relatively short. I don't know, 40, 50 pages, something like that. You might try that on this one. I don't know that I'm going to give you much more than that here. Husserl himself, although he picks examples from music for experience, is not commenting on their aesthetic qualities at all, right? He does want to give the aesthetic its own area of being, so to speak, but it's not the primary focus of his work. The places where he's reaching for music examples are because he wants to highlight to the audience in a way that's immediately intuitive these, let me put it this way, the temporalities of experience, right? So the temporalities of experience in the held tone, the melody, your memory of the performance in the concert hall yesterday, right? These are different ways in which your time is, in which your consciousness is having access to similar or the same intended object that is a piece of music. And he's using this to show you that the piece of music that you intend to be thinking about is not just a collection of immediately heard sounds. It's not a set of ringings in the room as you experience them. The piece of music itself is something more abstract than that, as well as more extended in time than that. So that's what he winds up using his music examples for. And there's no actual theory of art in Husserl. It's just he's just using it to explain time consciousness to people. I don't know if that helps.
No, and I would say that if Husserl's right, that, and I think really good evidence in terms of what I was alluding to with the way that human beings evolved, that really destroys Derrida. because that's why art doesn't progress, really. I mean, I'd say the arts don't progress in some ways, but do in others. Technologically, they progress, but with Western music, for example, the same chord progressions and the ratio of the more complex the ratio of harmonics, it's the more tension and dissonance that a listener will feel. And it doesn't matter where they're from. It doesn't matter what culture they're in. It's doing the same thing to the brain. And that would definitely buttress Husserl's claim over Derrida, especially when it gets into that feeling.
Yep. No, I can. Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you. Derrida's paradigm cases are less auditory, and even when he's talking about language, he wants to distinguish between language, speech, and writing. And for Derrida, writing is the primitive thing there. What is the notion of writing in Derrida? The notion of writing is not simply language, certainly not speech, but is the idea that you act by inscribing into the world something that system of signs fashions outlives, survives, and is exteriorized from you, that interacted with your mind in some way, and that other minds later interact with. That's sort of his primitive notion of writing. So writing in that sense would include carving symbols on things, playing music, writing things in a language, lots of things that are more a wider field of reference than what we would normally usually call writing in the sense of writing books, or certainly than writing handwriting. But anyway, that if you want a primer on that, the Derrida book to read is Of Grammatology.
Yeah. And the Heidegger would be the origin of the work of art, right? That essay?
Correct. The origin of the work of art in Heidegger. The other one that's also longer Heidegger is just the Nietzsche volume on the world as a work of art. And then for the Derrida stuff, the Of Grammatology. Fine questions. 10 minutes for further questions. We're going to meet again on the 21st. The reading for the next time will be The Intuition of Essences, 97, Philosophical Intuition, 121, and then the conclusion, summing up. So that takes us basically, it's on a little bit less than 60 pages, 55 pages. Intuition of essences. The critical thing is we already understood something about intuition when the mind has or the consciousness has the being itself as it intended it in front of it. The critical thing in the essences part is noticing that can be true of abstractions about the things we're thinking about. What do I mean by abstractions about things we're thinking about? This is going to be his notion of abstraction or generalization, his notion of an idea that's not going to be quite a Platonic idea, but which is a seeing something general in the particulars and then reasoning about those generalities. That's what he means by essences here, really. So intuition of essences and Husserl's claims that works. We can have intuitive knowledge of essences and can reason about the essences in ways which are truthful. And then specifically philosophical intuition, we already talked about intuition before, but a lot of the intuition we covered in chapter 5 was intuition in the sense of the intuition that happens in perception, the intuition that is there in logic, or the intuition that is there in math. Those things distinguish from each other, but unified as the notion of intuition. Chapter 7 is going to talk about all of that at the level of philosophical understanding. And in a way, this is an attempt to show how the kinds of operations and thinking that phenomenology in Husserl's sense himself does, how that kind of thinking fits into his own system, right? He wants to explain, he's given you ticket and sorted versions of where a truth of perception goes, where a truth of logic goes in his system. Now he wants to show you where a truth like his own philosophy goes in his own system, right? So that's sort of the subject of chapter 7. If you want to know where phenomenological analysis itself fits in the kinds of understanding that he claims the mind is capable of, or consciousness is capable of, that's what you're going to get in 7. So the phenomenological explanation of how the truth content of his own philosophy fits. He also is going to contrast that with the scientific and I put it. There's a notion that some of that philosophical understanding is being contrasted with, which is just sort of the natural attitude, whereby the natural attitude we just mean the things that an unskeptical consciousness takes for granted about how it navigates the world it's in, something like that. So there's going to be a contrast between philosophical intuition and sort of everyday twos of experience intuition, if that makes sense. Anyway, that's the point is that the next 2 chapters are really going to be about those refinements, which are in a way the more philosophical refinements. What is Husserl's take on the problem of the universals in a Platonic sense, right? You'll get that in the Essences chapter. What is his take on intuitive knowledge of phenomenology itself, or his own method applied to his own thought? Anyway, those are the remaining items. I would say that to me, the intuition of essences part is kind of the most interesting of these, in part because it's the place where you see to what degree is Husserl a Platonist idealist, and to what degree is he not any of those things. But if it's useful to sometimes think about philosophers in terms of by contrasting with other philosophers, I like understanding Husserl personally, in part by seeing what's similar and different about him compared to Plato, for example. I think there are aspects of what he's done that are rehabilitations of a lot of, if I can put it this way, abused Platonism. There were a lot of people in his time that had a very low opinion of Plato, and he had a significantly higher opinion of Plato. But he doesn't come out simply in a Platonic place in the end, if I can put it that way. But understanding what he sees as the way in which something like Platonic ideas are extracted from particulars in ways that are truthful. That's the subject matter of 6. Any questions about that before we? Okay. All right. We're pretty much at time. I think we've given everybody a chance for last questions, but all right. I hope this was fun. And other thing to think of for next time, besides doing this reading, is think about what, if anything, you guys might be interested in doing next. We had talked about doing some Kierkegaard next before this book. We could circle back and do that. I think Jim would be interested in that. And I think Gabriel was also interested in that. Sickness unto Death was the one we were talking about reading. So if anyone has other ideas besides that, let me know. It could be we do the Kierkegaard next and then could come back to whatever people are thinking of. But there's obviously tons more Husserl, but there's also Levinas, if you want to know where some of this phenomenology went after Heidegger instead of in Heidegger. We also talked about at some point possibly doing more Heidegger. We talked about this one in particular. I think Craig had suggested this one. So anyway, other possibilities, but I think it sounds like from without any other objections and after Jim's reaction, it sounds like we will probably want to do Kierkegaard after the 21st, which would probably mean 4th or 11th for the first one. Yes, Joe?
I'm happy with the Kierkegaard, and I'm going to cast an advance vote in the future for the Parmenides by Heidegger.
Okay. Yep. Cool. All right. Any other thoughts or suggestions? You can send me mail or put things up on the site. I will obviously, as soon as this thing manages to the recording manages to process, put it up on YouTube with the other ones. All right. See ya.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you very much.